The sound of a rifle shot echoed across the flat plain as Sarah Reynolds clutched her newborn baby to her chest, tears streaming down her face. It was October 1875, and the town of Julesburg, Colorado, had just witnessed something they'd never seen before: a woman and her infant daughter cast out into the unforgiving wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on their back and a small bundle of provisions. "You brought shame upon our name," Thomas Reynolds, Sarah's husband, shouted from the porch of their modest homestead. "I wanted a son to carry on my legacy, not another useless girl. You and that worthless child are dead to me." He fired another warning shot into the air, making Sarah flinch and hurry her steps away from the only home she'd known for the past 3 years. The baby in her arms whimpered, her tiny face scrunching up against the harsh October wind. Sarah adjusted the thin blanket around her daughter's small body, trying to shield her from both the cold and the hatred of the man who should have been her father. "Hush now, Elizabeth," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking as she trudged down the dusty road that led out of town. "Mama's going to find us somewhere safe." Sarah was 22 years old, with auburn hair that hung in limp curls around her pale face. Once considered the beauty of Julesburg, she now looked haggard and worn, her blue eyes rimmed with shadows from the difficult birth she'd endured just 4 days prior. She shouldn't have been walking, let alone fleeing into the wilderness with a newborn, but Thomas had given her no choice. The weight of his disappointment had been building throughout her pregnancy. "It had better be a boy," he would mutter each night as he placed a rough hand on her swollen belly. When the midwife had announced the birth of a healthy baby girl, Sarah had seen something break in Thomas's eyes. He'd left the room without a word, and she'd known then that trouble was coming. Now, as she walked away from town, Sarah realized she had nowhere to go. Her parents had died 2 years earlier in a cholera outbreak, and she had no siblings. Thomas had been all the family she had, and now he had rejected both her and their daughter because Elizabeth wasn't the son he'd demanded. The sun beat down on her back as she walked, each step becoming more painful than the last. Her body wasn't ready for this journey. The stitches from the difficult birth pulled with every movement, and she felt light-headed from exhaustion and hunger. But stopping wasn't an option. Thomas's threat had been clear: if she returned, he would consider her trespassing on his property, with all the consequences that implied. After walking for what felt like hours, Sarah stumbled and fell to her knees, only just managing to cradle Elizabeth safely against her chest. A sob escaped her lips as she realized she couldn't go any further. The small amount of food and water Thomas had grudgingly allowed her to take wouldn't last more than a day, and she was already weakening rapidly. "Lord help us," she whispered, looking up at the vast Colorado sky. The autumn sun was beginning to set, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now they only reminded Sarah that night was coming, and with it the dangerous chill of the high plains. The sound of hoofbeats made her heart race with fear. Had Thomas changed his mind, not about accepting them back, but about letting them leave alive? She'd heard the whispers in town about other men who had solved similar problems permanently when their wives failed to produce sons. Sarah clutched Elizabeth tighter and tried to push herself up to run or hide, but her legs refused to cooperate. "Madam, are you all right?" The voice wasn't Thomas's. It was deeper, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas origins. Sarah looked up to see a man atop a chestnut mare, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He was dressed in the dusty clothes of a working cowboy: worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. Sarah's voice cracked and she swallowed hard. "We've been put out. My husband. He didn't want a daughter." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing himself to be tall and broad-shouldered. As he approached, Sarah could see that he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 26 or 27. His face was weathered from the sun but handsome, with kind green eyes that crinkled at the corners, and a strong jawline covered with a few days' worth of stubble. "Your husband put you out because you had a girl." The disbelief in his voice was evident. He crouched down beside her, careful to keep a respectful distance. "With all due respect, madam, that man doesn't deserve to call himself a husband, let alone a father." Sarah blinked back tears. "He wanted a son. He said a daughter was worthless to him." The cowboy's jaw tightened and a muscle worked in his cheek. "That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard. Girls are just as worthy as boys. My pa raised 4 daughters and was proud of every single one of them." He glanced at the bundle in Sarah's arms. "May I ask how old?" "4 days," Sarah whispered. The cowboy's eyes widened in shock. "4 days? And he put you out to walk in this condition?" He stood up, his hands clenching into fists before he visibly controlled himself. "Madam, my name is Matthew Parker. I work at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles from here. If you'll allow it, I'd like to help you and your little one." Sarah hesitated. She didn't know this man, and in the West, accepting help from strangers could be dangerous. But the alternative was spending the night alone on the plains with her newborn, where coyotes, exposure, or simple starvation could claim them both. "I'm Sarah Reynolds," she said finally, "and this is Elizabeth." Matthew nodded, then gestured to his horse. "Mrs. Reynolds, you and little Elizabeth need shelter and care. The ranch where I work belongs to Robert Russell. He's a good man with a kind wife. They'd never turn away a mother and child in need." Sarah looked at the horse doubtfully. "I'm not sure I can ride in my condition." "You won't have to, madam. I'll walk and lead Daisy here. You just sit in the saddle and hold onto your little one." He extended his hand. "If you'll allow me to help you up." Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. With careful movements, Matthew helped her to her feet and then assisted her onto the saddle, making sure she was secure before handing Elizabeth back to her. The baby had fallen asleep, her tiny rosebud mouth slightly open. As Matthew began to lead the horse slowly toward the ranch, Sarah felt a mix of emotions: fear of the unknown, grief for the life she'd lost, and a small, tentative spark of hope that perhaps they might survive after all. "Mr. Parker," she said softly. "Thank you." He glanced back at her, the setting sun illuminating his profile. "No need for thanks, Mrs. Reynolds. No decent man would do any different." But Sarah knew that wasn't true. In the harsh realities of the frontier, many would have ridden past without a second glance. This man's kindness was as unexpected as it was precious. And for the first time since Elizabeth's birth, Sarah allowed herself to believe that they might have a future after all. The journey to the Double R Ranch took longer than Matthew had anticipated. He kept the pace deliberately slow for Sarah's sake, conscious of her fragile condition. The sun had fully set by the time they reached the ranch, and the windows of the main house glowed with warm lamplight against the darkness. "We're here," Matthew said, helping Sarah down from the saddle. She swayed on her feet, and he quickly put a steadying hand under her elbow. "Careful now." The front door opened before they reached it, spilling more light onto the packed dirt of the yard. A woman with silver-streaked dark hair stood in the doorway, her expression curious as she watched their approach. "Matthew, we were beginning to worry. Who's this you've brought with you, Mrs. Russell?" "This is Sarah Reynolds and her baby daughter, Elizabeth," Matthew explained as they reached the porch. "I found them on the road. Mrs. Reynolds' husband put them out because she bore him a daughter instead of a son." Clara Russell's face darkened with anger, but it quickly gave way to concern as she took in Sarah's exhausted appearance. "You poor dear. Come inside right away. Robert, Robert, come quickly. We have guests in need of help." The interior of the ranch house was modest but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace dominating the main room. Sarah nearly collapsed into the chair Mrs. Russell guided her to, the warmth of the fire making her realize just how cold she had been. Robert Russell, a sturdy man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, emerged from another room. He took in the situation with one quick glance, then nodded to his wife. "I'll fetch the doctor." "No need to disturb Doc Wilson at this hour," Sarah protested weakly. "We're just tired." "Nonsense," Clara said firmly. "You've just given birth days ago and been forced to travel. You need medical attention, and I won't hear otherwise." She gently took Elizabeth from Sarah's arms. "Let me hold this little treasure while you rest. Have you eaten?" Sarah shook her head, and Clara tutted disapprovingly. "Matthew, there's stew keeping warm on the stove. Would you bring Mrs. Reynolds a bowl while I get a room ready?" As Matthew disappeared toward the kitchen, Sarah found herself fighting back tears again, not of fear this time, but of relief and gratitude. Clara noticed and patted her hand. There, dear. You're safe now. The Reynolds name is known in these parts, and what Thomas has done is a disgrace. No man with a shred of decency turns out his wife and child." "Thomas always said a daughter was worthless," Sarah murmured. "That only a son could inherit and continue his name." Clara's expression hardened. "Then Thomas Reynolds is a fool as well as a cruel man. Our daughters are our greatest treasures." She looked down at Elizabeth, who was beginning to stir in her arms. "This little one deserves better than such a father, and you deserve better than such a husband." Matthew returned with a steaming bowl of stew and a chunk of fresh bread. The rich aroma made Sarah's stomach growl audibly, reminding her that she'd barely eaten all day. As she took the first spoonful, the flavor almost overwhelmed her meat, potatoes and vegetables in a thick, savory broth that tasted of safety and kindness. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Matthew. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." His green eyes met hers steadily. "Let's not think about that. You're here now, and that's what matters." Robert returned with the doctor within the hour. Dr. Wilson was a gruff man with gentle hands who examined Sarah with professional efficiency, then checked Elizabeth thoroughly. "The child is healthy, if a bit small," he pronounced. "But you, Mrs. Reynolds, need rest and proper nourishment. Those stitches are holding, but barely. No walking for at least a week and plenty of fluids and food." He looked at Clara. "She'll need care." "She'll have it," Clara assured him. "She and the baby will stay with us." "For how long?" Sarah asked, afraid to hope. Robert and Clara exchanged a glance. "For as long as you need," Robert said firmly. "We have the room, and Clara could use the company while I'm out with the men." "I can't impose." "You're not imposing if you're invited," Clara interrupted gently. "Besides, I've already fallen in love with this little angel." She smiled down at Elizabeth, who was now awake and looking around with unfocused newborn eyes. As Sarah was helped to a small but comfortable bedroom, with a cradle that Robert had quickly brought down from the attic for Elizabeth, she caught Matthew's eye as he stood in the doorway. "You've done more than enough, Mr. Parker," she said. "I'll never forget your kindness." He touched the brim of his hat. "Get some rest, Mrs. Reynolds. Things will look brighter in the morning." As she lay in the first real bed she'd been in since giving birth, with Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside her, Sarah allowed herself to believe that he might be right. The next few days passed in a blur of rest and recovery for Sarah. Clara Russell proved to be a godsend, helping with Elizabeth when Sarah was too exhausted to get up, bringing nourishing meals and offering the kind of motherly advice that Sarah, orphaned young, had never received. Matthew stopped by the house each evening after his work was done, always with some small gift, a wildflower he'd spotted on the range, a piece of wood he'd whittled into a tiny horse for Elizabeth when she was older, or simply news from town that might interest Sarah. A week after her arrival at the Double R, Sarah was sitting on the front porch in the cool evening air, Elizabeth sleeping in her arms when Matthew rode up. He dismounted and approached with his hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Evening, Mrs. Reynolds. How are you feeling today?" "Much better, thank you, and please call me Sarah. After all you've done, formality seems unnecessary." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Sarah, then, but only if you'll call me Matthew," she nodded, and he settled onto the porch step near her chair. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues. "I went into town today," Matthew said finally. "Thought you should know that folks are talking about what Thomas did. Not many approve." Sarah tensed. "What are they saying?" "That he's shown his true character, and it's an ugly one." Matthew's voice was gentle but firm. The minister at the church was particularly vocal, said that children are a blessing regardless of their sex, and that a man who can't see that isn't fit to be a father. Sarah looked down at Elizabeth's sleeping face, so peaceful and trusting. "He didn't even hold her, not once." Matthew's hands tightened on his hat. "His loss, then. She's a beautiful child." "Yes, she is." Sarah touched Elizabeth's cheek gently. "I just worry about her future." "A girl without a father's name or protection has a difficult path in this world." "She has your name," Matthew said. "And as for protection—" He hesitated, then continued more softly. "There are good men in this world, Sarah. Men who would consider it an honor to protect both of you." Sarah glanced at him, caught off guard by the undertone in his voice. "Matthew," he looked away, a flush rising up his neck. "Just saying that you shouldn't lose hope. You've got friends here now." Before Sarah could respond, Clara appeared in the doorway. "Supper's ready, you two." "Matthew, you're staying, of course?" "Wouldn't miss your cooking, Mrs. Russell," Matthew replied, rising to his feet. He offered Sarah his hand, and after a moment's hesitation she took it, allowing him to help her up. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked hard for his living. But his touch was gentle as he steadied her, his fingers lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary before he released her. As they walked inside, Sarah found herself wondering what it might be like to have a man like Matthew in her life, a man who saw worth in a daughter, who offered help without expectation, whose eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled at Elizabeth. It was a dangerous thought, one that she quickly pushed aside. She was still legally married to Thomas, regardless of his rejection, and her heart was too recently broken to trust again. But as she watched Matthew across the supper table, laughing at something Robert had said, she couldn't help the small flutter in her chest. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah found herself looking forward to tomorrow. The weeks passed, and October gave way to November. Sarah's strength returned fully, and she insisted on helping Clara with the household chores to earn her keep. Elizabeth thrived under the care of the two women, growing plumper and more alert each day. Her eyes, initially the dark blue of all newborns, began to lighten to a clear green that reminded Sarah startlingly of Matthew's. Matthew continued his daily visits, and it became a ritual for him and Sarah to sit on the porch in the evenings, talking as the sun set. Sarah learned that he had grown up in Texas, the only son among 4 sisters. His father had been a rancher who had treated all his children equally, teaching the girls to ride and rope alongside their brother. Pa always said that spirit and determination mattered more than whether you wore trousers or skirts. Matthew told her one evening as they watched a spectacular sunset paint the sky. "My sisters could all outride most men, And Eliza, she's the oldest, can shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 50 paces. Sarah smiled, imagining the kind of childhood Matthew must have had, surrounded by strong women. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. Matthew's face grew somber. Lost him 2 years ago to pneumonia. Ma's running the ranch now with my sisters. They're doing just fine without me, which is why I came north looking for work. You must miss them terribly. Matthew nodded. Every day, but I write to them regularly and Ma writes back. She'd like you, I think. He glanced at her, then quickly away. And Elizabeth, of course. Ma's always had a soft spot for babies. Sarah adjusted the blanket around Elizabeth, who was cradled in her lap, awake and observing the world with curious eyes. Perhaps someday we'll meet her. I'd like that, Matthew said softly. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Robert, who had been in the barn, emerged with a rifle in his hands, his expression wary. Stay here, Matthew told Sarah, standing up and moving protectively in front of her and Elizabeth as 3 riders came into view. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she recognized the lead rider as Thomas. He looked thinner than when she'd last seen him, his face haggard and his clothes disheveled. The 2 men with him were strangers to Sarah, rough-looking individuals whose hands stayed suspiciously close to their holstered guns. Thomas reined in his horse and dismounted, his eyes fixing on Sarah with an intensity that made her shrink back. So this is where you've been hiding. She hasn't been hiding, Matthew said, his voice deceptively calm. She's been recovering from being thrown out by her husband after childbirth. Thomas's eyes flicked to Matthew, narrowing. And who are you to interfere in a man's family business? Someone who knows that putting a woman and newborn child out to die isn't family business, it's criminal, Matthew replied evenly. Thomas took a step forward, but Robert moved to stand beside Matthew, his rifle not quite pointed at Thomas but certainly held ready. What do you want, Reynolds? Robert asked bluntly. Thomas's gaze returned to Sarah. I've come for my wife. The town's been talking and it's bad for business. Your wife? Matthew's voice held barely controlled anger. You mean the woman you abandoned, the one you said was dead to you? Mind your tongue, cowboy. This isn't your concern. It became my concern when I found them half dead on the road, Matthew shot back. You gave up any right to call yourself her husband when you did that. Thomas's hand moved toward his gun, but Robert raised his rifle slightly. I wouldn't, Reynolds. Not on my property. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Clara appeared in the doorway behind Sarah, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Sarah, take Elizabeth inside. Sarah hesitated, afraid of what might happen if she left. Thomas had always had a volatile temper, and he was clearly in a dangerous mood now. But Elizabeth began to fuss, sensing the tension, and Sarah knew she needed to protect her daughter above all else. She stood and quickly retreated into the house with Clara, but remained by the window where she could see and hear what transpired outside. You've turned my wife against me, Thomas accused, glaring at both Robert and Matthew. You did that yourself when you cast her out, Robert replied calmly. No man with a shred of decency would have done what you did. A man has a right to expect a son. A man has a responsibility to love his children, regardless of whether they are sons or daughters, Matthew countered. My father raised 4 daughters and was proud of every one of them. Girls are just as worthy as boys, and any man who can't see that doesn't deserve to be called a father. Thomas's face flushed with anger. I didn't come here to be lectured by some ranch hand. Sarah is my wife, and I'm taking her home. And if she doesn't want to go, Matthew asked quietly. She doesn't have a choice. The law is on my side. From inside the house, Sarah felt a chill run through her. Thomas was right legally. She was his property with few rights of her own. If he insisted on taking her back, there would be little anyone could do to prevent it. But the thought of returning to the man who had cast her out, who had been willing to let her and Elizabeth die rather than accept a daughter. The law might be, Robert acknowledged, but public opinion isn't. Word's gotten around about what you did, Reynolds. The minister's been particularly vocal. How do you think your business will fare if you drag your wife back against her will after what you did? If the women of Julesburg decide not to patronize your store? Thomas's confidence wavered visibly. His general store was the main source of his income, and in a town the size of Julesburg, a boycott could be devastating. Furthermore, Robert continued, Dr. Wilson has documented the condition Sarah was in when she arrived here. If any harm should come to her or the child after you take them back, you'll have more than public opinion to worry about. The standoff continued for several more tense minutes, with Thomas making threats and demands that were calmly rebuffed by Robert and Matthew. Finally, seeing that he wasn't going to get his way easily, Thomas mounted his horse again. "This isn't over," he warned, looking toward the house where Sarah stood watching. "She's still my wife." As he rode off with his companions, Sarah sagged against the window frame, weak with relief. Clara put an arm around her shoulders. "He'll be back," Sarah whispered. "He's right, the law is on his side." "We'll figure something out," Clara promised. "Robert has connections in Denver. There might be legal options." But Sarah knew how difficult divorce was for a woman, especially on grounds of cruelty. Unless Thomas agreed, which he clearly wouldn't, out of pure spite she could be trapped in this limbo indefinitely, neither truly married nor free. Matthew and Robert came inside, both looking grim but determined. "We won't let him take you, Sarah," Matthew said immediately. "Not if you don't want to go. How can you stop him? He's right about the law." "The law also says a man must support his wife," Robert pointed out. "He put you out without provision. That's abandonment, which could be grounds for divorce in some cases." Sarah shook her head. "It would take years and money I don't have." "But maybe there's another way," Matthew said slowly. "Reynolds is a proud man. His pride was hurt when people found out what he did. What if we could offer him something that would salve that pride while giving you your freedom?" "What could possibly accomplish that?" Sarah asked. "Money," Robert said, catching on to Matthew's thinking. "A business arrangement. He agrees to a divorce, and in return receives compensation for his generosity in releasing you from the marriage." "I don't have any money to offer him," Sarah reminded them. Matthew squared his shoulders. "But I do. I've been saving almost everything I've earned since I started working. It's not a fortune, but it might be enough to tempt a man like Thomas Reynolds." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Matthew, no, I can't let you do that. That's your future you're talking about giving away." He met her gaze steadily. "What better use for it than to secure freedom for you and Elizabeth? Besides, I've been thinking of starting my own small ranch eventually. I can save again. It's too much to ask. You're not asking. I'm offering." The determination in his eyes was unmistakable. "Let me do this, Sarah, please." Sarah looked from Matthew to Robert and Clara, seeing the same resolve in all their faces. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life truly free from Thomas, a life where she could make her own choices, where Elizabeth would never have to face the rejection of a father who couldn't see her worth. If you're sure," she said finally. "But I'll repay you somehow, I promise." The smile Matthew gave her was gentle. "We'll work that out later. For now, let's focus on getting you your freedom." The negotiations with Thomas proved to be as difficult as they had anticipated. Robert, who had experience in business dealings, handled most of the discussions, with Matthew present but silent unless directly addressed. Thomas initially scoffed at the idea, declaring that no amount of money could compensate him for the embarrassment Sarah had caused. But as Robert methodically outlined the alternatives, the continued gossip, the potential impact on his business, the documentation of his abandonment of Sarah and Elizabeth that could be presented to a Judge, Thomas's resistance began to waver. The final tipping point came when Robert mentioned that several influential citizens, including the bank manager, had expressed their disapproval of Thomas's actions. In the end, Thomas agreed to a divorce in exchange for a sum that represented most of Matthew's savings. The papers were drawn up by a lawyer in Denver whom Robert knew, and by mid-December, Sarah received the document that declared her legally free from her marriage to Thomas Reynolds. "I can hardly believe it," she said, staring at the paper in her hands as she sat with Matthew on the porch. The day was cold, but they were bundled in warm coats, and Elizabeth was snug inside with Clara. After everything, to be free so quickly. "You deserve your freedom," Matthew said simply, "and Elizabeth deserves a chance at a life without that man's shadow over her." Sarah looked at him, taking in the steady green eyes, the strong profile, the hands that had worked so hard and given so generously. Over the weeks, her feelings for Matthew had grown from gratitude to genuine affection, and something deeper that she wasn't yet ready to name. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you," she said softly. "I didn't do it expecting repayment. I know. That's what makes it all the more meaningful." She hesitated, then reached out to place her hand over his. "But I'd like to try in time, once I've found work and can support Elizabeth properly." Matthew turned his hand over to clasp hers. "You know, there's a small cabin on the east side of the ranch property. Robert mentioned it might make a good place for you and Elizabeth if you wanted to stay on. Clara could help with Elizabeth while you worked." "Worked?" Sarah repeated, confused. Matthew nodded. "Robert says his wife could use help with the books and correspondence for the ranch. Apparently, you mentioned to Clara that you had some education." "My father insisted on it," Sarah confirmed. "I can read, write, and keep accounts reasonably well." "Then it seems a perfect arrangement. You'd have independence but also support close at hand." He squeezed her fingers gently. "And I'd know you were safe." The care in his voice made Sarah's heart flutter. "You've done so much already, Matthew, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." His gaze was intent. "Sarah, I care about what happens to you and Elizabeth, more than I probably should, given how short a time we've known each other." Sarah felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "I care about you too, Matthew. You've shown me that good men do exist in this world." A smile spread across his face, lighting his eyes. "Then perhaps in time, when you're ready, we might see where this caring leads." Sarah returned his smile, feeling a lightness in her heart that had been absent for too long. "I'd like that very much." As winter settled over the Colorado plains, Sarah and Elizabeth moved into the small cabin Matthew had mentioned. It was rustic but sound, with a sturdy fireplace and enough room for the two of them to live comfortably. Clara helped her furnish it with pieces from the main house and items purchased in town, while Matthew spent his free time making repairs and improvements. A new shelf here, a repaired window frame there, always with care and attention to detail. Sarah began working for the Russells, keeping their accounts and handling correspondence. She had a natural aptitude for the work, and Robert soon trusted her with more responsibility, including negotiations with cattle buyers. The arrangement allowed her to support herself and Elizabeth while still having plenty of time with her daughter, who was growing and thriving with each passing day. Matthew continued his daily visits, now stopping by the cabin rather than the main house. Sometimes he brought dinner, sometimes just himself, but always he brought a warmth that made the small cabin feel like a true home. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, talking about their days, their hopes, their dreams for the future. Elizabeth would often be cradled in Matthew's arms, looking up at him with what Sarah could have sworn was adoration in her infant eyes. As Christmas approached, the weather grew harsher, with snow piling up around the cabin and temperatures dropping well below freezing. Matthew took to staying later, ensuring that Sarah had enough firewood and that the cabin was warm before he would leave for his own quarters in the bunkhouse. On Christmas Eve, a particularly fierce storm blew in from the north, bringing howling winds and driving snow that reduced visibility to near nothing. Matthew had arrived earlier than usual, bearing gifts wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "You shouldn't have," Sarah protested when she saw the packages. "Nothing extravagant," he assured her, setting them under the small pine tree he had cut and brought for her the week before. "Just a few things to make the holiday special for you and Elizabeth." Sarah had gifts for him as well, a new scarf she had knitted during the long evenings, and a leather-bound journal for the poems he occasionally wrote, but rarely showed anyone. She had discovered his secret talent one evening when a piece of paper had fallen from his pocket, revealing verses of surprising sensitivity. As they sat before the fire, sharing a simple but delicious meal Sarah had prepared, the storm outside intensified. Wind rattled the windows, and the temperature in the cabin began to drop despite the blazing fire. "I don't think you should try to make it back to the bunkhouse tonight," Sarah said, concern evident in her voice. "The storm's too dangerous." Matthew hesitated. "It wouldn't be proper for me to stay, Sarah. Your reputation, my reputation, is less important than your life," she interrupted firmly. "Besides, who would know or care? The Russells understand the danger of winter storms, and there's no one else around for miles." After further protest, Matthew reluctantly agreed. Sarah made up a pallet of blankets near the fire for him, while she and Elizabeth would take the small bedroom. As they sat together that evening, the storm raging outside while they remained safe and warm within, Sarah felt a sense of rightness that she had never experienced with Thomas. Here, with Matthew and Elizabeth, she had found a peace and contentment she hadn't known was possible. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, noticing her pensive expression. "That sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best," she replied honestly. "If Thomas hadn't cast us out, I never would have met you." Matthew's eyes softened. "I thank God every day that I found you on that road, even while I curse the circumstances that put you there." The firelight cast a golden glow over his features, highlighting the sincerity in his expression. Sarah felt a tug of emotion that went beyond gratitude or friendship. "Matthew," she said softly, "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, as fragile and beautiful as snowflakes. For a moment, Matthew seemed frozen in place. Then he moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I fell in love with you the moment I saw you on that road, holding Elizabeth so protectively despite your own pain. I've been trying to find the right time to tell you, to make sure you were ready to hear it." "I'm ready now," she said, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've been ready for a while, I think. I was just afraid to trust again." "I would never hurt you the way he did," Matthew vowed. "You and Elizabeth are precious to me. I would spend my life proving that to you if you'd let me." Sarah touched his face gently, tracing the line of his jaw. "I believe you. You've shown me the kind of man you are through your actions, not just words." Matthew turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "Sarah Reynolds, I love you. You and Elizabeth both. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." "Are you proposing, Matthew Parker?" Sarah asked, a smile playing at her lips despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I suppose I am, though I'd planned something more romantic than a snowstorm for the occasion." He returned her smile. I don't have much to offer yet, but I'm saving again. In a year or two, I could have enough for a small place of our own. Until then, we could stay here if Robert and Clara agree." "I don't need much," Sarah assured him. "Just you and a home filled with love for Elizabeth." She paused, suddenly unsure. "But are you certain you want to take on another man's child, to raise her as your own?" "Elizabeth isn't another man's child to me," Matthew said firmly. "She's yours, and she's perfect just as she is. I already love her as if she were my own daughter." His expression grew serious. "I want to be the father she deserves, one who sees her worth, who teaches her to be strong and kind, who shows her how a man should treat the women in his life with respect and love." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks at his words. "She couldn't ask for a better father than you." "Is that a yes, then?" he asked, his own eyes suspiciously bright in the firelight. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "1,000 times yes." Matthew rose enough to take her in his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise. Sarah melted into his embrace, feeling as though she had finally found her way home after a long, difficult journey. When they parted, both a little breathless, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, Sarah." "The merriest," she agreed, her heart too full for more words. In the small bedroom, Elizabeth made a soft sound, and they both smiled. Their family was small but perfect, a family built not on duty or obligation, but on choice and love. The storm continued through the night and into Christmas Day, effectively stranding Matthew at the cabin. Not that either of them minded. They exchanged their gifts by the firelight, played with Elizabeth, and talked about their future together. Matthew spoke of his dream to have a small ranch of his own someday, with good grazing land and a comfortable house for them all. "Elizabeth will need siblings," he said as he cradled the baby, who was fascinated by the buttons on his shirt. "Brothers or sisters, it doesn't matter. All children are blessings." "I'd like that," Sarah agreed, watching the tender way he handled her daughter. A house full of children, all knowing they're loved regardless of whether they're boys or girls. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, Matthew reluctantly returned to his duties at the ranch, but not before extracting a promise from Sarah that they would be married as soon as the spring thaw made travel to Denver possible. He wanted to do things properly, with a church wedding and a minister. "You deserve to be a bride surrounded by flowers and sunshine," he told her. "Not a hasty ceremony in the dead of winter." Sarah would have married him that very day, but she appreciated his desire to give her the wedding she hadn't had with Thomas. Her first marriage had been a rushed affair at the county clerk's office, with no celebration or sentiment attached. The winter months passed in a blur of quiet joy for Sarah. She continued her work for the Russells, saved what money she could, and watched Elizabeth grow more alert and responsive each day. The baby had Matthew wrapped around her tiny finger, cooing and smiling whenever he entered the cabin. By March, Elizabeth was beginning to sit up with support, her green eyes so like Matthew's, taking in the world with clear interest. She had Sarah's auburn hair, which was starting to come in more fully, and a temperament that was generally sunny unless she was hungry or tired. "She's going to be a beauty like her mother," Matthew often said, to which Sarah would reply that she hoped Elizabeth would have his kind heart and steady nature. April brought the first real thaw, and with it, preparations for their wedding. Clara helped Sarah make a simple but lovely dress of cream-colored cotton, trimmed with lace that the older woman had been saving for a special occasion. Robert offered the use of the main house for the small reception, and even arranged for the minister from Julesburg to make the journey to the ranch for the ceremony. On a perfect May morning, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of new growth, Sarah stood beside Matthew before a small gathering of friends and neighbors. Elizabeth, now 7 months old, was held by Clara, dressed in a tiny white gown that Sarah had stitched by hand. As she spoke her vows, Sarah felt none of the anxiety or doubt that had plagued her first wedding. Instead, there was only certainty and joy, a bone-deep knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with the man who had shown her what true love looked like. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said, beaming at them. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Parker." Matthew's kiss was tender but held a promise of passion that made Sarah blush. When they turned to face their guests, Elizabeth reached for them, her small face alight with a gummy smile. Matthew took her from Clara, and the three of them stood together, a family united not by blood or obligation, but by choice and love. The small reception that followed was filled with laughter and good wishes. Robert surprised them with news that he was giving them a parcel of land on the eastern edge of his property, not far from where they currently lived. "Consider it a wedding gift," he said gruffly. 20 acres with good water access, enough to start that ranch you've been dreaming of, Matthew." Matthew was speechless with gratitude, and Sarah had to wipe away tears at yet another act of generosity from people who had become family to them in every way that mattered. That evening, after the guests had departed and Elizabeth was asleep in her cradle, Matthew carried Sarah across the threshold of the cabin that was now their temporary home until they could build on their new land. "Mrs. Parker," he said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "How does it feel to have a new name?" "Wonderful," Sarah replied honestly. "Like I've finally become who I was always meant to be." Matthew's kiss was deeper this time, filled with the love and desire he had respectfully restrained during their courtship. Sarah responded with equal passion, secure in the knowledge that this was a man who valued her for herself, not for her ability to provide him with sons. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Matthew's hand resting protectively over her middle, he whispered, "I want you to know that I'll love our children equally, Sarah. Boy or girl, it makes no difference to me. Each child is a gift." "I know," she murmured, placing her hand over his. "That's one of the countless reasons why I love you." The years that followed were ones of growth and joy for the Parker family. Matthew worked tirelessly to build their home on the land. Robert had given them a sturdy 4-room cabin with a covered porch and large windows that let in the Colorado sunshine. Sarah helped where she could, always with Elizabeth nearby, the little girl watching with interest as their home took shape. By the time Elizabeth was walking and talking, the house was complete enough for them to move in, though Matthew continued to add improvements whenever he had time. He had also acquired a small herd of cattle and several horses, the beginnings of the ranch he had dreamed of. On the evening of Elizabeth's second birthday, after a small celebration with the Russells, Matthew and Sarah sat on their new porch, watching their daughter play in the yard with a puppy that had been her gift from Uncle Robert and Aunt Clara, as she called them. "I have news," Sarah said, her hand finding Matthew's. "I visited Dr. Wilson yesterday while you were checking the north pasture." Matthew turned to her, concern immediately evident in his expression. "Are you ill?" "Quite the opposite." Sarah's smile was radiant. "We're going to have another baby, Matthew, sometime in the early spring." His face transformed with joy, and he gathered her into his arms, mindful of her still flat stomach. "Sarah, that's wonderful news. Are you feeling well? Do you need anything? Should you be resting more?" She laughed at his barrage of questions. "I'm perfectly fine. Dr. Wilson says I'm healthy and strong, and there's no reason to expect anything but a normal pregnancy." Matthew pressed a kiss to her forehead, then leaned down to place another gentle kiss against her middle. "Hello in there, little one. We're already so excited to meet you." You truly don't care if it's a boy or girl? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Not in the slightest, Matthew confirmed. Boy or girl, this child will be loved beyond measure, just like their sister. He glanced at Elizabeth, who was giggling as the puppy licked her face. Though I imagine Elizabeth might have a preference. She's been quite clear about wanting a sister to play with. Sarah laughed. She has, hasn't she? Well, we'll have to wait and see. The winter months passed peacefully, with Matthew hovering protectively around Sarah despite her assurances that pregnancy was a natural condition, not an illness. He took over more of the household chores, enlisted Elizabeth as his special helper, and made sure that Sarah rested frequently. As her body changed, Sarah found herself reflecting on the differences between this pregnancy and her first. With Thomas, there had been constant pressure and worry, his frequent comments about needing a son weighing heavily on her mind. With Matthew, there was only joy and anticipation, his delight in each small development, the first flutter of movement, the gradual swell of her belly making the experience a shared journey rather than a solitary ordeal. Elizabeth, now a chatty and curious toddler with her mother's auburn curls and her adoptive father's green eyes, was fascinated by the changes in Sarah's body. She would place her small hands on Sarah's growing stomach, her face lighting up with wonder when she felt the baby move. "Baby sister," she would announce confidently. "It might be a baby brother," Matthew would gently remind her. Elizabeth would consider this possibility momentarily before shaking her head decisively. "No, sister," Sarah and Matthew would exchange amused glances over her head. Elizabeth had inherited a healthy dose of stubbornness from somewhere, though neither would claim responsibility for that particular trait. In late March, as the first signs of spring began to appear on the Colorado plains, Sarah went into labor. Unlike the difficult, frightening experience of Elizabeth's birth, this time she was surrounded by support. Clara came to help, having assisted at many births over the years. Matthew remained close at hand, keeping Elizabeth occupied while also making frequent trips to Sarah's bedside to offer encouragement and support. After several hours of labor that progressed steadily and without complications, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and eyes that, when they briefly opened, revealed the same deep blue that all newborns possessed. "A son," Clara announced, placing the swaddled infant in Sarah's arms. "A fine, strong boy." Sarah gazed down at her son's face, overwhelmed with love. When Matthew entered the room, Elizabeth in his arms, his expression was one of pure awe and adoration. "Sarah," he whispered, sitting carefully beside her on the bed. "He's perfect." "Would you like to hold your son?" she asked, offering the bundled infant to him. Matthew took the baby with practiced ease, having spent so much time carrying Elizabeth. His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he looked from his son to his wife. "Thank you for this gift, Sarah, for our family." Elizabeth peered at her new brother with interest. "Baby," she said, reaching out a gentle finger to touch his cheek. Then, with the honesty of a 2-year-old, she added, "Not sister." Sarah and Matthew both laughed. "No, sweetheart," Sarah confirmed. "This is your baby brother. What should we call him?" They had discussed names but hadn't settled on a final choice, wanting to meet the baby first. "What about Robert?" Matthew suggested. "After the man who gave us our start, we could call him Robbie." Sarah nodded, tears of joy slipping down her cheeks. "Robert William Parker, William for my father." "It's perfect," Matthew agreed. "Welcome to the world, Robert William." As the small family sat together on the bed, the spring sunshine streaming through the window, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of less than 3 years. From the darkest moment of being cast out with a newborn daughter, to this pinnacle of happiness with a loving husband, and now 2 beautiful children. It was a journey she could never have imagined. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked softly, noticing her pensive expression. "That sometimes the worst moments in our lives truly do lead to the best," she replied, echoing the words she had spoken to him on that Christmas Eve during the snowstorm. "If Thomas hadn't rejected Elizabeth and me, I never would have found you and this life we've built together." Matthew leaned forward to kiss her gently. "Then I find myself in the strange position of being grateful to a man I otherwise despise, because finding you and Elizabeth was the greatest blessing of my life." Elizabeth, growing restless, wiggled down from the bed to retrieve a toy from the corner of the room. As she played happily, baby Robert dozed in his father's arms, and Sarah leaned back against the pillows, tired but deeply content. "I love you, Matthew Parker," she said simply. "You showed me that girls are just as worthy as boys, and in doing so, you gave me and Elizabeth a chance at the life we deserved." "I love you too, Sarah Parker," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "And I plan to spend the rest of my days proving it to you, to Elizabeth, and now to little Robbie here. You're my heart, all of you." Outside the window, the Colorado spring continued its slow awakening, a fitting metaphor for the new life that had begun within the walls of their home. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to fully experience the moment: the warmth of the sun, the soft sounds of her daughter playing, the gentle weight of her husband's hand holding hers, and the knowledge that their family, built on love and acceptance rather than outdated expectations, would continue to grow and thrive in the years to come. 5 years later, 1882, the Parker Ranch had grown significantly in the 5 years since Robert's birth. What had started as 20 acres and a small herd was now a respectable operation of 75 acres, with a growing reputation for quality cattle and horses. The original 4-room cabin had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and increased prosperity. Elizabeth, now 7 years old, was a spirited, intelligent girl with her mother's auburn curls, and a confidence that came from being raised by parents who valued her mind and spirit. She attended the small schoolhouse that had been built 3 miles away, riding there daily on a gentle pony that Matthew had trained especially for her. Robert, at 5, was his sister's devoted shadow, always trying to keep up with her adventures. He had Matthew's dark hair and steady temperament, but Sarah's blue eyes and artistic inclinations. Unlike Elizabeth, who was passionate about horses and outdoor activities, Robbie showed an early interest in books and drawing. And then there was Margaret, their surprise addition, born 2 years after Robert. At 3 years old, Maggie was a force of nature, fearless, vocal, and determined to be included in everything her older siblings did. She had a mop of blonde curls that defied taming and green eyes that sparkled with mischief. On a warm September afternoon, Sarah stood on the porch of their home, watching as Matthew taught Elizabeth the finer points of roping a fence post. Robert sat nearby, intently drawing in a small sketchbook, while Maggie alternated between trying to join the roping lesson and pestering her brother. "Mama, look," Elizabeth called, successfully looping her small lariat around the post. "I did it." "Well done, sweetheart," Sarah called back, smiling at the pride on her daughter's face and the equally proud expression on Matthew's. "My turn," Maggie demanded, tugging at Matthew's trousers. "You're still a bit small for the big rope, pumpkin," Matthew told her gently, "but let me find you your practice one." He produced a shorter, lighter rope that he kept specifically for Maggie, and with infinite patience, began showing her how to twirl it. Sarah's heart swelled as she watched him, with their daughters always encouraging, never dismissive, treating their interests with the same seriousness he would have given a son's. Robert looked up from his drawing. "Mama, come see what I made." Sarah crossed the yard to where her son sat, crouching beside him to examine his work. The drawing was remarkably good for a 5-year-old, a detailed sketch of their house with the mountains in the background. "This is beautiful, Robbie," she said sincerely. "You've captured the mountains perfectly." His face lit up at her praise. "Do you think Papa will like it?" "He'll love it," Sarah assured him, smoothing his dark hair. "Why don't you show him when he's finished with the girls' lesson?" As if on cue, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Sarah looked up to see Robert and Clara Russell making their way toward the house, a now familiar Saturday afternoon occurrence. Over the years, the Russells had become grandparents in all but blood to the Parker children, spoiling them with attention and small gifts. Uncle Robert. Elizabeth abandoned her roping lesson to run toward the approaching riders. Robert and Maggie quickly followed, with Matthew walking behind them at a more sedate pace, smiling at their enthusiasm. Clara dismounted with Robert's help, immediately opening her arms to receive Maggie, who launched herself at the older woman. "My goodness, you get bigger every time I see you," Clara exclaimed, hugging the little girl tightly. "And more beautiful, too. I can rope now," Maggie announced proudly. "Papa showed me." "Did he indeed? I'll have to see this demonstration later," Clara replied seriously, before greeting the other children with equal warmth. Robert Russell, now in his 60s but still robust, dismounted with a grunt. "Got any coffee on, Sarah?" The ride seemed longer than usual today. "Freshly made," Sarah confirmed, moving forward to embrace both Russells. "Come inside. The children can show you their new accomplishments after you've rested." As they all headed toward the house, Sarah felt Matthew's arm slip around her waist. He pressed a kiss to her temple, a gesture of affection that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "Happy," he murmured. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "I was just thinking how fortunate our children are to grow up with so much love around them." Matthew's gaze followed their daughters, who were chattering excitedly to Clara about their roping progress. "Elizabeth is becoming quite the horsewoman. She'll be out riding me by next year at this rate." "Like father, like daughter," Sarah teased. "Though Robbie seems to have inherited my father's artistic talent. Did you see his latest drawing?" "I did. That boy has a gift." Matthew's voice held equal pride for his son's artistic abilities as for his daughter's horsemanship. "And Maggie, well, heaven help us all when she gets older." "That girl fears nothing," Sarah laughed. "She's her father's daughter too. I recall someone telling me about climbing the tallest trees in Texas just to see how far he could see." "Guilty as charged," Matthew admitted with a grin. "Though I hope she shows a bit more sense than I did. Nearly broke my neck more than once." They reached the porch, where Robert was showing his drawing to the Russells, both of whom were making appropriately impressed noises. Maggie was attempting to climb onto Robert Russell's lap, while Elizabeth had run to fetch her school primer to show Clara her improving reading skills. "I'll get the coffee," Sarah said, slipping out of Matthew's embrace. "And there's fresh apple pie, too." "You spoil us," Clara said, following her inside while the men and children remained on the porch. "Though I admit I've been thinking about your apple pie all week." In the kitchen, as Sarah prepared a tray with coffee and slices of pie, Clara helped by gathering plates and forks. "You look well, Sarah," the older woman observed. "Content." Sarah smiled. "I am, more than I ever thought possible." She paused in her task, looking out the window at the scene on the porch. Matthew now seated with Robbie on one knee and Maggie on the other, listening intently as Elizabeth read aloud from her primer. Robert Russell nodding encouragement. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is my life," Sarah continued softly. "When I think of where I was that day Matthew found me on the road." Clara's hand covered hers briefly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. That terrible day led you here to this family, this life." "It did," Sarah agreed. "And I'm grateful every day, not just for Matthew and our children, but for you and Robert too. You took in two strangers and treated us like family." "You are family," Clara said simply. "The children we never had." The two women shared a moment of understanding before finishing their preparations and carrying the refreshments out to the porch. As Sarah distributed slices of pie and poured coffee for the adults and milk for the children, the conversation flowed around her Elizabeth's progress in school, Robert Russell's plans for his cattle, Maggie's latest adventure climbing onto the barn roof, Robbie's growing collection of sketches. Later, as the afternoon waned and the Russells prepared to depart, promises were made for the Parkers to visit the main ranch the following weekend for Sunday dinner. The children waved enthusiastically as the older couple rode away, then scattered to their various activities, Elizabeth to practice her roping, Robbie to continue his drawing, and Maggie to follow her sister with determined imitation. Sarah and Matthew stood on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, watching their children in the golden light of late afternoon. "You ever wonder what Thomas is doing now?" Matthew asked unexpectedly. It was rare for either of them to mention her former husband. Sarah considered the question. "Sometimes. I heard from Mrs. Wilson last month that his store is doing poorly. Apparently, he remarried a few years ago a much younger woman, but she left him last winter. They had no children." Matthew tightened his arm around her. "I shouldn't feel satisfaction in another's misfortune, but it's hard not to see a certain justice in it," Sarah finished for him. "The man who cast out his wife and daughter for not producing a son now has no children at all, while we have 3 beautiful ones." "3 perfect ones," Matthew corrected, his gaze following Elizabeth as she successfully roped a fence post, her face alight with triumph. "A family built on love rather than expectations." As the sun began to set, painting the Colorado sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of despair on that dusty road outside Julesburg to the heights of joy she now experienced daily, it was a path she could never have foreseen, but one she would travel again without hesitation if it led to this life, this family, this love. "Come on, children," Matthew called. "Time to wash up for supper." There were the expected groans and pleas for "just 5 more minutes, Papa." But eventually all 3 children made their way to the house, bringing with them the energy and noise that had become the heartbeat of their home. As Sarah moved to prepare the evening meal, with Maggie insisting on helping despite creating more mess than assistance, she caught Matthew's eye across the kitchen. The love and contentment in his gaze mirrored her own feelings, a silent acknowledgement of the life they had built together. A life founded on the simple truth he had spoken that day on the road. That girls are just as worthy as boys, and that all children deserve to be loved for exactly who they are. In that moment, surrounded by her family in the home they had created together, Sarah knew that she had found something far more precious than mere survival. She had found belonging, purpose, and a love that had not only saved her but had shown her the true meaning of family, not defined by duty or tradition, but by choice, acceptance, and unwavering love. And as the Parker family gathered around their table that evening, their laughter and conversation filling the house with warmth, it was clear that the journey that had begun in rejection had led to the most perfect of destinations, a place where every child was valued, where love was the foundation of all things, and where the future stretched before them filled with promise and possibility. The end.